This video is brought to you by StonyLabs. You can support the channel and receive 10% off by using code Wheeler at checkout. Right now, I'm dumping 10,000 Russian honeybees into their new home. And here's something you probably didn't know. If one of them was to sting you, it would smell like bananas. But why? Because honeybees have their own secret language. They don't talk like we do. They dance, they tap antennae, they send vibrations to the hive's floor, they even change the tone of their buzz when they're angry. But the most powerful signal isn't sound, it's chemicals. Let's take a look at a bee sting up close. The stinger punches through the skin, the barbs locking in like tiny fish hooks, and it starts pushing venom. The bee lets go and flies off, but the stinger stays behind, still alive, still working. You can see the venom sac pulsing, pumping its chemical payload deeper and deeper with each contraction. And right alongside that venom, something else is escaping into the air, a faint, sweet banana scent. It's not for you, it's a chemical signal, a chemical rallying cry for every bee nearby, screaming, "Attack this thing right now." The chemical responsible for that is called isoamyl acetate, a compound you've probably eaten without even realizing it. It's in bananas, apples, and pears, and an artificial banana flavoring. Think banana Laffy Taffy. In fact, it smells so strongly like bananas that its nickname is banana oil. So today we're going to make some isoamyl acetate in the lab and then see how bees respond to it when they smell their own battle cry. But first, we need to head to the lab to make some. The synthesis of isoamyl acetate is surprisingly simple, and it's a classic inorganic chemistry. It's made using a reaction called a Fischer esterification. And once you understand it, you can create an entire rainbow of artificial scents. Apple, pear, wintergreen, strawberry, raspberry, rum, and many, many more. The smell that you get all depends on which two starting chemicals you mix together. That's part of what makes this reaction so iconic. It's easy, it's versatile, really cool, and it's often one of the first organic reactions students learn for those reasons. In fact, it was the first reaction that I ever did. We start with a 100 milliliter round bottom flask. We clamp this up, then drop in a stir bar. Now we can start pouring in our reagents. First up, dry isoamyl alcohol. Despite the sweet banana scent of our final product, isoamyl alcohol itself smells awful. It has a strong alcohol smell, and some say it smells like feet. Anyways, not something you'd want in a candle. Of this stinky alcohol, we pour in 20 milliliters. Next comes our second stinky ingredient, glacial acetic acid. This isn't the mild concentration of acetic acid you find in vinegar. Even the strongest vinegar you can buy in the store is maybe 13% acetic acid, the rest is water. Glacial acetic acid, on the other hand, is close to 100% pure. At this concentration, it freezes just below room temperature, forming icy crystals, hence the name glacial. And more importantly for us, it has almost no water. And we pour in 25 milliliters of it into the flask. A quick safety note, this reaction is approachable, however it's still important to practice basic safety procedures. Wear gloves, eye protection, and work in a well-ventilated space or fume hood. If you follow proper precautions, it's a safe and fun synthesis you can try. I'm saying that now because our next chemical is much more dangerous than the ones we just added. Now we could stir and heat this mixture all day, but without a little help, nothing much would happen. What we need is a catalyst, something that speeds up the reaction without being consumed by it. In a Fischer esterification, that help comes from the form of a strong acid. A few options work, but sulfuric acid is the classic choice. I lower the flask into the stirring mantle and start stirring next. We can now add our acid slowly, about 5 milliliters. Why slowly, you may ask? Because the moment the sulfuric acid hits our mixture, it reacts exothermically. That means it releases heat fast. And if you dump it in too quickly, things can get a little too exciting. With all our chemicals combined, it's time to actually make them react faster. To do that, we add heat using a heating mantle, and it quickly heats up our mix. Now, once at temp, a process called reflux starts. In reflux, the mixture is heated until it vaporizes, then cools so the vapors condense and drip back into the flask. This lets the reaction run hot without losing any of the material to evaporation. Here's why heat helps. For chemistry to happen, molecules need to collide, and not just bump into each other, but to do so with enough energy to break bonds and form new ones. Temperature is directly tied to a molecule's internal energy, which affects how fast it vibrates and moves. More heat means faster moving molecules, more collisions, and a faster reaction rate. All this falls under the field of chemical kinetics, the study of how quickly reactions occur. In our case, we gently heat the mixture for about an hour around 120 degrees Celsius, during which the esterification is in full swing, steadily transforming our foul-smelling isoamyl alcohol into sweet-smelling isoamyl acetate. A few minutes in, the mix smells strange, like socks with a faint whiff of fruit trying to break through. It's proof that the reaction is working. But here's the catch. Making isoamyl acetate isn't enough. We need a way to stop it from undoing itself. The problem is we are producing the chemical, but the Fischer esterification is a reversible reaction, meaning that even after the isoamyl acetate forms, it can just easily break apart back into the starting materials. Left alone, the system will settle into an equilibrium, where the reactants and products are being made and destroyed at the same rate. Think of it like a seesaw, perfectly balanced but not getting us any closer to a flask full of banana oil. So how do we tip that balance in our favor? Enter everyone's favorite eccentric Frenchman, Le Chatelier. His principle states that if we disturb an equilibrium, the reaction will shift to counteract the change. In our case, we can selectively remove one of the products from the reaction mixture. Once it's gone, the reaction can't easily run in reverse, so it keeps pushing forward, steadily producing more isoamyl acetate. Think back to our reagents: pure glacial acetic acid, dry isoamyl alcohol, and sulfuric acid. None of them contain water, but as the reaction runs, water is produced as a byproduct. And the sulfuric acid loves water. It acts like a sponge, binding it up so it can't re-enter the reaction and push things backwards. That's Le Chatelier's principle in action, quietly nudging the equilibrium towards more isoamyl acetate. After an hour of reflux, the chemistry is done, but now we've got a new problem. Our precious banana oil is there, it's just trapped in a cocktail of leftover acid, alcohol, and catalyst. I pour the reaction mixture into a separatory funnel, our go-to tool for liquid-liquid extractions. To start cleaning it up, I add 50 milliliters of distilled water. This helps pull out the leftover acid from the organic layer. After a good shake to mix the layers, venting often to release any pressure, I set aside and watch the two layers form slowly, separating from each other. The aqueous layer, now carrying away much of the excess acid, is drained off and discarded. I repeat the wash with another 25 milliliters of distilled water, each rinse leaving us our isoamyl acetate a little bit cleaner and a little closer to that pure banana scent. There's still some leftover acid hanging around in my organic layer, so I need to deal with that before moving forward. I pour the organic layer back into the separatory funnel, then add about 25 milliliters of 5% sodium bicarbonate solution. This is the same stuff you'd find in baking soda. And here it acts to neutralize any remaining acid by reacting with it to form carbon dioxide gas, water, and a harmless salt. As soon as the solution touches the organic layer, I can see fizzing start up. That fizzing is carbon dioxide escaping, which is a good sign that the reaction is happening. I leave the funnel unsealed for a few minutes to let the gas production slow before closing it for shaking. When I do shake, I make sure to vent the funnel often by carefully inverting it and opening the stopcock to release pressure. If you don't vent frequently, that buildup of carbon dioxide can make the stopper pop off. Once the fizzing calms down, I allow the layers to separate, then drain off the aqueous layer. I repeat this bicarbonate wash a couple of times, waiting for the material to stop bubbling, which once it stops bubbling, it means all the acid has been reacted with. I keep repeating these washes until I get that result. You may notice some procedures call now to wash the material with 5 milliliters of saturated brine solution a couple of times. This can be needed, but I find in most cases it's really not, so I'll be skipping that step. Now with our acid-free organic layer, we now need to dry it. To do that, I add a drying reagent. I use molecular sieves here, but you can use anhydrous sodium sulfate. The drying reagents bind to any water that might be in the organic layer, pulling it out, which prepares us for the next step. The washes we just did cleans it of any aqueous impurities, but if there's any isoamyl alcohol left over, it can't get rid of that, so we need to do another step. We can purify the ester by simple distillation, a technique where we separate liquids based on their different boiling points. You can set up a simple distillation setup quite easily with a couple pieces of glassware, or alternatively you can use a short path distillation column like I'll be using here. I set up the distillation apparatus with the round bottom flask on the heating mantle, then the condenser with a thermometer right in the vapor path, and then running into a clean receiving flask at the other end. This setup allows us to heat our mixture until the components we want turn to vapor, and then cool it back down into a pure liquid. I start stirring and gently heat the organic layer, keeping a close eye on the thermometer. We will collect the isoamyl acetate in a boiling point range of 135 to 143 degrees Celsius. Anything that boils below that is most likely alcohol or any other smaller impurities. Anything that boils above that is larger impurities that we don't want to collect. Once we hit 135 degrees Celsius, I switch out flask to a clean collection flask and start collecting our purified isoamyl acetate. With our product coming over in the target range, I start to see steady drops forming at the tip of the condenser. The moment they hit the receiving flask, a sweet, fruity aroma drifts up, completely different than the sweaty sock-like odor of our starting alcohol. This is our first unmistakable sensory confirmation that our chemistry has worked. We've transformed two unpleasant smelling reagents into something that smells like ripe banana. If you were in the lab, you'd notice that change instantly. The vapors aren't harsh on the nose like acetic acid, and they aren't sharp like the alcohol. They're soft and warm, almost like candy. But as tempting as it might be to keep smelling, I'm working in a well-ventilated space because breathing in concentrated vapors of any organic compound isn't a good idea for too long. Remember, in chemistry, we have a special way of smelling things. We want to waft it. When you smell chemicals, you don't stick your nose directly into the bottle or collection flask. You waft air containing that chemical towards you. Due to my fume hood being a proper fume hood, it's pulling enough that I can't smell the chemical that I'm working with. So if I want to smell it, I have to turn off the hood to waft the chemical. I transfer the liquid into a bottle to weigh on a scale, and we come out just above 13 grams of final product. I take this bottle and I place it into a properly labeled jar. Remember to always label your chemicals properly because when you come back in a couple months, your memory will fail you. At this point, I can smell the sweet, fruity banana scent filling the lab, and that's a strong clue we've made isoamyl acetate. But in science, smell alone isn't enough. Our noses are a pretty good detector, but they're also very subjective. One person's banana might be another person's pear. A smell can't tell us about our purity or confirm that the exact molecule is what we say it is. So how do we really prove and give evidence to what we think it is? That's where analytical chemistry comes in. The part of science is dedicating to figure out what exactly is in our sample. We could use infrared spectroscopy or IR. This technique shines light through a sample and certain wavelengths get absorbed depending on which bonds are present. Isoamyl acetate has a distinctive carbonyl peak from the ester group that shows up loud and clear in an IR spectrum, like spotting a friend's face in a crowd. There's also a few other places where we can see distinctive peaks. If I wanted to be sure, I could take a small portion of our product and then run it through a gas chromatography mass spectrometer, or GCMS for short. The gas chromatography would separate the components of the mixture based on how easily they vaporize, and the mass spectrometer would weigh and break apart those molecules to give a fingerprint-like pattern. If those fingerprints match one for pure isoamyl acetate in the chemical database, then we have solid confirmation, which we do. In real research, this kind of multi-step evidence is how you move from I think to I have evidence for. First you observe, like our smell test, then you measure, then you compare against known standards. Each layer of evidence makes the conclusion stronger until you've built a case that would hold up in a lab report, a journal article, or sometimes a courtroom. Through the reaction, we generate byproducts in the form of waste products we don't want. And we need to handle this waste responsibly. We can't just dump this down the drain. So I'll be adding this to a jug of non-halogenated waste, which will be treated at a later date. With the banana oil ready, it's time to see if we could speak to the bees using their chemical language. I set up 2 cinder blocks in front of the 3 busy hives, each topped with a cotton pad. One pad got a few drops of isoamyl alcohol, the control. The other was my freshly synthesized isoamyl acetate. First up, I put a couple drops of the isoamyl alcohol onto the first pad, and nothing really happened. Then I stood over the second pad, bottle in hand, and twisted the cap off. The reaction was almost instantaneous. From the moment that the first whiff had escaped in the air, the hives shifted from a calm industry to a full battle station. The hum of the beehive changed into an angry, telltale sound. Bees began to pour out from the entrance in a steady stream, crowding the landing boards until they overflowed. They didn't hesitate. The flight patterns weren't random or wandering arcs. They landed straight, direct line for the bottle. I barely had enough time to squeeze the drops onto the cotton pad before they were all over the bottle. Some hovered inches away from the glass, pivoting in the air to keep the distance from the enemy. Others made a short, sudden lunge forward, bumping into the sides of the bottles and then circling it back to try again. It was clear that they recognized the scent, but there was one thing. Bees don't just sting anything that smells wrong. They rely on movement to trigger that final strike. A glass bottle doesn't twitch, flinch, or swat at them. Without that movement, their aggression takes on a different form. Harassment flights, direct contact, and intimidation displays. That's exactly what I'm seeing here, a full-on chemical alarm response, but without the stings, because their target wasn't alive in their eyes. Still, their intent was unmistakable. The bottle was the enemy number one. In bees' terms, this was the smell of a battle already in progress, a target already marked by another bee sting. Even without the stings, the enemy was electric. I was once holding onto the bottle containing the chemical, which means inevitably some probably got onto my gloved hand, which means they wanted to attack me as well, which they tried, but because I was wearing a beekeeping suit, I was nice and protected. They also went after my camera. I let this go on for a few minutes before brushing the bees off the bottle and putting it away. As soon as the bottle was away, everything went back to normal and all the bees went back into the hive. And there we have it. Thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something. Time to start the next project.